Our theme this year has been Born of Slavery, Rooted in Freedom. The Wesleyan Church was actually formed 169 years ago on May the 1st, 1843. Leroy Sutherland, Orange Scott, and Luther Lee seceded from the Methodist Church. They seceded over the issue of slavery. They didn't believe in it, and in fact, the one bulletin board has Luther Lee's quotes on it. And the Wesleyan Church was born out of that. And it's also the story, though, of us as Christians, because we were born in slavery. We were enslaved to sin until we found Christ. And then we found our freedom. And today our roots lie in freedom. But this play is going to trace the history of the Underground Railroad, because that's one thing that the Wesleyans were really, really radical about back then. They got involved. They helped those slaves move from the south to the north to Canada. We have some bulletin boards out there that you can look at and read an awful lot about. But Luther Lee was one of the big abolitionists, and you'll hear about him in the play. When they sold that church, they started an excavation. And in the basement of the church, they found a tunnel. On the tunnel, they found faces carved in the wall, dated back to the days of slavery. Those faces are today in the Onondaga Historical Museum in New York. You'll also meet Laura Smith Haviland. She was a Quaker who became a Wesleyan. She actually lived just north of Windsor, Ontario. She actually moved into Canada. She was born in Canada, went to Michigan, moved back. She actually received the slaves when they came into Canada, when they crossed the border. And she helped set them up and get them started and settled in Canada, so you'll meet her as well. But this is a musical production. The cast is here, the chorale is here. We invite you to sit back to enjoy it, and we'll talk with you afterwards.
Please.
Thank you.
It is a vast continent with many countries, many cultures, and many people, and it is where our story began. Slavery, the complete control of one human being over another's life. It is an evil that has existed throughout the ages and sadly continues to exist even today. The African slave trade began in the 1600s and did not end until the mid-1800s. African tribes fought against one another. The winning team gathered the men, women, and children from the losing tribe, marching them to the ocean, incarcerating them in large compounds and waiting for the European ships to come in. When they arrived, the prisoners were sold to the Europeans, who exported these people to plantations around the world, where they were sold again as slaves. They lost everything they had ever known or had, and become the property of another. The year is 1843. The slaves are toiling on the plantations. From the rising of the sun until the setting of the day, the slaves work in the heat and oppressive conditions, are at the mercies of their masters and overseers. Any misstep, any error, no matter how trivial, could result in punishment, beating, denial of food, or being sold privately or at auction to another slave owner. The slave had no control over his own freedom. He was the property of his master. Now, not everyone agreed with slavery. A group of Methodists were ardently oppressed to slavery. It was not of the Bible, it was sin, and it was wrong. When the Methodist Church refused to abolish slavery, members of the congregation, Orange C. Scott, Leroy Sunderland, and Luther Lee, left the Methodist Church. They called their new association the Milliken Wesleyan Methodist Connection. Today we call it the Wesleyan Church. Our church was born out of slavery. The early Wesleyans were hung, beaten, shot, and even killed over their stance against slavery. It was not easy being a Wesleyan in the early days. Yet, in spite of the threats, the physical assaults, and the hatred of slave owners, the Wesleyans stood their ground. They became active in the Underground Railroad, aiding those who dared to become freedom seekers. Together with the freed, blacks, Quakers, and other religious groups opposed to slavery, they assisted thousands of slaves through their journey to Canada,